This podcast is brought to you by the School of Advanced Study, University of London.
Thank you very much for the invitation, which came last September, and I forgot about it. It's always easy to accept invitations which are 6 months away, so the reality this morning came to me. What I suggested I should speak about then was, the abstract I gave was that in 1980 very few of the present umbrella organisations existed. For example, there was no Institute of Fundraising, no ACF, no Community Foundations, no Akivo, no European or international bodies. And quite interesting, I think, from your point of view, there were no statistics and there were no journals, there were no lectures, there were no conferences, there was no tax efficiency except for a 7-year covenant with a maximum of £3,000 a year. So the whole infrastructure, which we've now come to take, I think, for granted, simply didn't exist. And I think probably the Charities Aid Foundation, which I ran from 1982 to 2002, had really quite a significant role in all those changes. And that is what, if you want me to talk about, I'm capable of talking about, because I ran the thing. I'm not a researcher or indeed an academic. I left school at the age of 16 and joined the Navy, and after a very varied career in the Navy, I left the Navy at the age of 30 and joined an advertising agency called J. Walter Thompson in Berkeley Square. I mention that because J. Walter Thompson was the leading advertising agency at the time, and therefore to actually handle the accounts that I handled involved something which I think gets quite close to research in your area. It was market research. Our advertising was market research based, and therefore we had things like focus groups. We have things that I can't pronounce, like epidemiological cohorts of several thousand people. My particular concern was a computer model which decided that if Lurpak, Kerrygold, Australian something, Anchor Butter spent this amount of advertising on which JWT make 15% profit, then the difference between the market share of stalk margarine and butter would go from 54% to 56%, which would lead to a massive profit for the butter companies. So I had a little sort of sideways introduction into research as a result for working for JWT. There are also several lunches a day, literally 2 on one occasion, one for Voluntary and the other for Unilever, over a 4-hour period. So in the interest of my liver, I left that and joined an organisation called then the Spastic Society, which I think is interesting for me because it's probably the biggest job I ever had. I walked into it kind of sideways, not knowing what was involved. I had 600 charities or branches. I had 150 shops. I had a football pool. I was responsible for the fundraising and the biggest charitable mailing list, cold and warm, in the country at that time. And of course, we were also responsible for campaigning on behalf of cerebral palsy. I remember standing uneasily in Trafalgar Square, and if ever you have to deliver a speech in Trafalgar Square, where the lions are, you'll find that the thing slopes down. So you're just about to say something when you think you're about to fall into the crowd. Anyway, we got 1 million signatures and delivered them to Number 10 on behalf of things that I no longer know what they mean. Perinatal mortality, perinatal morbidity, outrageously high compared with Denmark and Sweden. What is the government going to do about it? So this was a kind of introduction to effective campaigning. The second, I think, or the other 2 points I'd like to make about the Spastic Society, as far as I'm concerned, and as far as I think what I'm trying to say to you is concerned, is that despite all those sort of exciting activities, the significant fact was that government paid less than 60% for a disabled person, that is either the Secretary of State, the Department of Health and Social Security, or local authorities. Here's Foster Murphy, I'm just about to quote you. And we, over a period of time, over a period of about 6 or 7 years, from 75 to 82, we managed to get the average contribution by the statutory authority from something over 50 to something over 80%. So per individual, as you now know, it's now much closer to 100%. That shows what was happening. I think at that time, the late 70s, the Wilson-Callaghan government, between the sector and government response, between individual contribution, between fundraising, private support, and government support. The second quite interesting thing, I think, and this sounds a bit yo-ho, indeed is a bit yo-ho, I decided that it would be a good idea to raise the profile of cerebral palsy by sponsoring an ASCOT meeting. And so I managed to worm my way into Binky Beaumont's organisation in Ascot, and was told that the chairman of this would be a guy called James Davigor Goldsmith. James, Major General James Davigor Goldsmith, was an old-fashioned sort of guy. And when he discovered, he vetoed various things, like any kind of promotion for this event which would make it financially successful. And we all had to go into different entrances from other people. He then discovered that I was being paid to run the appeals directorate of the Spastic Society. And from that point, he took a pretty dim view of me and the whole event. So that's not all that long ago. We're talking about 70-something. So you put on a kind of thing at Ascot, and the guy running it is called Major General Sir Davigor Goldsmith, and he suddenly finds that a fundraiser is being paid to raise money. Bloody outrageous. So that's an example of a long time ago, well, only 30 years ago, so not so long ago. I then left the Spastic Society, not least because Tim Yeo pushed his way in, and I didn't actually get the director's job, so I had to find something else to do, and I joined the Charities Aid Foundation as its director at that time. Just a couple of words about the Charities Aid Foundation to explain what I want to go on to develop about the way things have changed over the last 30 years so dramatically. It was kind of quasi-official because it came out of the national, as it then was, the National Council for Social Services, FOSTA. I think it was then called before 1973. And the NCVO started, I think, in 1919 as a result of Lloyd George and what to do about people coming back from the war who were possibly revolutionary, certainly poor and very unemployed, and a lot of them were wounded. And then because people started to chuck money into it, they set up in 1924 a thing called the Charities Aid Fund, CAF. And the Charities Aid Fund remained with the NCSS until 1973, when, because the NCSS, about to become the NCVO, this is all historical research for those interested, we decided, a guy called Sir Anthony Burney and Lord Goodman decided that the NCVO, as it probably had become, was actually using chunks of money from the trusts in the Charities Aid Fund, rather in their own interests, rather than the interest of the people that they were. You can question, you can contradict that. So various people decided the Charities Aid Fund should become the Charities Aid Foundation, and the payment for that was a 3% distribution to the NCVO from the throughput of the new Charities Aid Foundation. The significance of that little fight was that the Charities Aid Foundation, which I then started to run 5 years later, had an amazingly powerful board. So although it was really a tiny operation, and it had 84 people compared with the nearly 1,000 people that I'd left at the Spastics, and my room was not in Park Crescent, in a big place looking over Regent's Park, was in an attic in an old building in Tunbridge. Nevertheless, there were the kind of makings there. The Duke of Edinburgh was the patron, Lord Goodman was a trustee, Sir Anthony Burney, the chairman of Debenhams, was a very powerful chairman of the Charities Aid Foundation. Sir James Dunnett, who was the longest serving permanent secretary, just retired after 12 years at the Ministry of Defence. And we had clients like Earl Mountbatten. So this funny little bureaucracy, which was actually wholesaling, or I probably mean retailing covenants. So if you had a covenant for £3,000 and you wanted to give £100 to a particular charity, then you made the donation to the Charities Aid Foundation, and we, the Charities Aid Foundation, asked you to fill in a form about that long in triplicate, which said this is, etc., 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 and we'd then give money to shelter or whoever you wanted to give it to. So that was what I found. A paper-shifting, tax-dodging organisation based in an attic with powerful trustees who were not doing anything. The question is, what should one do with it? The throughput then was £2 to £3 million, and the amount of money, as it were, in investments and trusts and so on, was £12 million. So thinking about my problem, which I hope will relate to your interest in the history over the last 30 years, what on earth should one do with this outfit? And we had no competitors, so that was a start. And in J. Walter Thompson terms, we also had no brand. And no competitors, no brand indicated to me that what we clearly had to do was not grow CAF, but grow the market in which CAF had no competitors. So my first attempt to do this was to say to these distinguished trustees who had had a decent lunch is that we need a development budget. And one of the attractive things, and there were many unattractive things in 1982 about the British economy, was inflation was running high, and all our money related to a fee, and the money held, which was inflationary, every year it grew by 10-20% in monetary terms. So we were making a lot of money, even though the value of the money was going down slightly. So we had lots of money to play with. So we got a development budget, and we then proceeded to fund various activities to do with the whole market rather than CAF itself. And the first, I think, and probably most successful one was at a meeting with the Duke of Edinburgh. I said we needed to create an umbrella organisation, and he said, well, of course I will help with that. And this became known as the Council for Charitable Support. This was chaired by Lord Goodman, and we had various eminent people like Charles Forte of Forte on it. Robert Carr, a previous Home Secretary, very, very nice, gentle guy, very clever. Len Murray, you may remember. He was succeeded by Norman Willis, of course, the chairman of the NCVO, the chairman of CAF, people like Mark Weinberg. Sir Richard O'Brien, if you remember the church, whatever it was called, the effort of the churches to get him, what was it called, Kathy, the Church Urban Fund? Something like that, yeah. And he was also the chairman of the PSI, so he had a kind of research influence, Policy Studies Institute. People like Adam Ridley, who was Lord Rothschild's part of the CPRS, I think it was called, the think tank that advised government, was on it. And of course, eventually Willie Whitelaw, and also people like Lord Durrandall. So we had this amazing outfit. Question is what to do with it. They met, And here was I thinking, from my attic, Christ, these guys want to do something. So we said, right, what the Council for Charitable Support is going to do is promote charity and the idea of philanthropy, and from a very marginalized charitable sector. You've got to remember that somebody like the Duke of Westminster was paying an effective tax of 98% and could give £3,000 away tax-free under a covenant as long as it's signed for over 7 years. So a pretty dire situation, an outrageous situation. And so we started to work on the first thing we did was to work on the revenue. And we developed successful relationships with various people in the revenue. The most significant one, I think, probably was a guy called Clive Corlett. I don't know if Richard, you remember Clive Corlett? He worked very closely with Nigel Lawson, but before that, Peter, somebody who lived in Tunbridge, I suddenly found him down the road from my attic, who was the political advisor to Geoffrey Howe. So he got Geoffrey Howe to come to a conference at the Charities Aid Foundation, and Geoffrey Howe got involved. So we had a most remarkable result in 1983. We got tax exemption on trust income from £3,000 to £5,000, and it was reported in the press as a magnificent achievement, absolutely pathetic. And then a year later, it went from £5,000 to £10,000. And one of the reasons for that was Geoffrey Howe spoke at our conference, and he announced our new statistical base, where people could press a button on a computer and find out how much people were giving. I still remember this. It was the International Press Centre. And when he came, the thing didn't work. So I said to somebody, well, create a bloody picture on the computer and I'll tell him to press this button and this will come up. And I said to him, this is the question you've got to ask and no other question, then press that button. So he said, how much will the poor give if something? Press a button and it said 2.6%. Fantastic. A complete con. Never mind. Then the 1986 with the Annus Mirabilis, when as a result of Clive Corlett, who I'd taken to lunch on a number of occasions, speaking very closely to Nigel Lawson, we got suddenly no limit to any amount of giving. We got the single gift for companies, so companies could give once off tax-free, which they couldn't before. They also had to do a covenant. And I thought more important than any of that, we got what CAF called the Give As You Earn scheme, which I think is properly called the payroll deduction scheme. And that allowed anybody employed to make a contribution before tax was considered for their pay in the same way as national insurance. And I said to my trustees, this is going to go to 100 million within the next year. I think 15 years later, it got to about 100 million. It was bureaucratic and disappointing. Nevertheless, the idea that the Charities Aid Foundation should pursue a campaign by ingratiating itself with the revenue, with the Treasury, I suppose with the Home Office, but I can't remember that at that time, to make giving completely tax exempt, I think over the 1980s succeeded. And one thing I think that we did successfully, looking at this form which I've just described, where you had to fill in triplicate, etc., in order to bifurcate a covenant to different charities, was replaced by the checkbook. Somebody said to me in my attic, you can't have a checkbook. It's just not, a charity can't issue a checkbook. It's just not allowed. So I had lunch. I'm very keen on lunches with Robin Lee Pemberton, and asked him whether he would host a meeting to launch a significant thing at the Charities Aid Foundation at the Bank of England. So he agreed. So we all trooped along to the Bank of England, which was pretty powerful in those days, probably still is, and Robert and Lee Pemberton was chairing it, etc. And nobody turned a hair, nobody noticed when we launched the charity checkbook in the Bank of England. I thought that was good. Moving on, I want to talk about not so much the tax thing as what happened to the infrastructure of what we call the voluntary sector, civil society, during those years, particularly the 80s and the 90s. I think one of the successful things we did at the Charities Aid Foundation was to launch, apart from our conference, which various important people turned up and pontificated at, people like John Major, Douglas Hurd, and all the rest of them. We did something, I think, which I'm really quite proud of, and that is we launched the annual Goodman Charity Lecture. And that was as early as 1983, and the first speaker was Ralph Dahrendorf, and indeed 19 years later, in 2002, the last speaker was Ralph Dahrendorf, who'd always been a close friend and supporter of the Charities Aid Foundation, and in my view, a great guy. I'm not sure about his opinions, but nevertheless, he went off the rail at one point. And I think from your point of view, we had some quite significant sort of academic research people, as well as the sort of people like Basil Hume, the Archbishop of Westminster, and so on. And apart from Dahrendorf, what about this name? Professor Bernard Williams? Richard? You can't get better than that at a charity lecture with his ex-wife sitting in the front row. And she seemed to think what he said was good. Then we had Brewster Kingman, who was I was trying to remember whether Yale or Harvard. I think he was the president of Harvard. Just going back anecdotally, I first met him in Venice when I'd get to the International in a moment. We traveled on the boat to some island, some awful conference organized by somebody. And Kingman, Brewster and I wanted to get ashore from this island as fast as possible, but the earliest boat was 6 o'clock that evening. So everybody was forced to listen to these dull American-type lectures. So I managed to get onto a telephone and got a boat which took us over from this place to the Lido. And Kingman, Brewster and I didn't know him, had an extremely pleasant lunch in the place where Death of Venice was shot. And we sat in these wicker chairs, and we were almost weeping at the recollection of the thing. Mahler came sort of weeping. So when I invited him to give a lecture, he really couldn't refuse, particularly as I'd paid for the lunch. So he came. It wasn't a very good lecture, actually, but never mind. And there's various people like Lawson Whitelaw, etc., Duke of Edinburgh. And we had a very good audience, apart from Richard Freese, who often turned up. There were other as intelligent people, like, for example, Sir Jeremy Morse, who was the chairman of Lloyd's. And so these lectures became, I think, quite important in terms of putting the propositions about how to increase philanthropy, how to encourage people to give, how to be responsible citizens, and so on. And I think they played their part. With regard to the rest of the infrastructure, which didn't exist at that time, probably the most successful one is now called the Institute of Fundraising. It was called the ICFM. Somebody came along to me, I think it was, I've forgotten his name, there were several people who wanted to replicate what was happening in the United States and the United Kingdom, have some kind of institute. And I'm talking probably about 1984, 85, something like that. The Americans had two separate organizations. One was called the AAFRC, the Association of American Fundraising Council, run by a guy called Jack Schwartz in New York, and the other one was called the ICFRE, which was to do for ordinary fundraisers rather than corporate fundraisers. So we decided to put these two things together and set up the ICFM. Charities Aid Foundation's role was not so much with the thinking or indeed the chairmanship of it. That was a guy called George Medley, who ran the World Wildlife at that time, and was a pretty hands-on person. What we did do was pay for the salary of the first secretary, and that was Di Yo. I think for about 3 years or 4 years, we paid whatever she got to do that. So we made a contribution to it being kind of professional. On the Community Foundation side, there was no ACTAF. And the Charities Aid Foundation and the Mott Foundation, I can't remember when, set up a challenge. I think it was also 86. And as a result of that £3 million challenge for the corpus of 3 community foundations, the Tyne and Wear Foundation, the Cleveland Foundation, and the Bristol Foundation were set up, and an organisation was set up. And I'm looking at, I can't see her, she's here somewhere, was part of it, yes. And I can't remember what it was called, the first one.
I think ACTAF was the first one.
No, it was a committee, the something committee, and you were a member of the committee from the NCVO. You were part of the NCVO at that point.
Yes, and the Home
Policy.
Office gave some pilot funding.
Yes.
100,000 for 3
Yes.
years. That's
Yes.
the beginning of the funding.
What you did, and I've never forgiven you, from the NCVO's point of view, because I had a plan, which was to create a hierarchy of community foundations with an imperial centre called the Charities Aid Foundation. So we would get many more donors and so on at the local level using the same systems as the Charities Aid. Then when I wasn't looking, you suddenly made it independent. So it became ACTAF and run by somebody called Kim Maxwell. So they'd floated out. I couldn't get hold of it any longer. But I think the Charities Aid Foundation can take some credit for participating, at any rate, in the setting up of community foundations, which didn't exist, which are now growing, I think, very rapidly, aren't they, still? And the London Community Foundation, of which you're a trustee, is moving up to the Premier League.
You may not want this comment now, but I think you should take an awful lot more credit.
I'm willing to do that.
There were a couple of things that were community foundations already.
That's right. There was a woman in Yorkshire.
They didn't know it. You discovered the model in the States.
Yes.
And enabled its development through.
Yeah. And then, amazingly, you may think, you may not, I don't know. I mean, I'm not as young as you are. There were no publications. There was no journal. There was no statistics, as Cathy would know. The only statistics there were one, a thing called the Directory of Grant-Making Trusts, which was at CF before I arrived, set up by Red Mullin, of fame or infame, but very clever guy, and he replicated the American Directory of something foundations, and that was there. There was a piece of paper, literally, which we published, I think, or I don't know whether we published it, but it existed, which showed the top 10 companies by the amount that they gave. So you had Marks and Spencer's and you had I don't know what, and that was it. There was nothing about individual giving. People didn't know, as far as I'm aware, how much individuals gave, whether it was going up or whether it was going down. So again, over a period of some years, with Cathy involved, and before Cathy, Susan Saxon Harold, and before her, Judith McQuillan, and after Cathy, I don't know, somebody else probably. And then that was nicked by the NCVO, and it became the NCVO Almanac, which is actually a very good, I think, and professional thing. So quite rightly, they took it over. But from my point of view at that time, the idea that if you listed companies and said, this is the best and this is the worst, let's have 100 rather than 10, then we had 1,000 rather than 10. and they all tried to get up towards the top. And it was all published, and it all appeared in the newspapers. So the whole thing led to, indirectly led to, I think it was probably more important than anything else, but I may be exaggerating, the emphasis in many responsible companies about how big is their social corporate responsibility budget and what has it been spent on, etc. So that was a bit of the infrastructure. The charities, it was called Charity Magazine, was the first publication that we funded, and that was, well, it was the only one. So people read it. I think it came out fortnightly, and people read about who's going up and who's going down, and a whole lot of stuff invented in the back pages to fill in the actual columns. But at least it was a magazine for the sector. That was eventually taken over, I think, by NGO Finance. And then the relationship of the Charities Aid Foundation with organisations like Lenter, the London Enterprise Agency, run by a guy called Brian Wright. And what he hated most of all was Stephen O'Brien coming along and saying, hold on a second, Lenter must be replicated across the country. So we got the creation, I think in about 1983, of Business in the Community, run by Stephen O'Brien. So the companies began to get together in terms of social responsibility. At the beginning of my 30 years ago, that did not exist, nor did the Percent Club exist, nor did people like Mark Weinberg and Joel Joffe and Hector Lang of United Biscuits and the Prince of Wales and all this sort of, which are now part of the furniture, let alone that woman whose middle name is Charity. What's her name? The guy that she took over from Stephen O'Brien. Doesn't matter.
You don't mean Julia
Cleverden, Julie Cleverden. Yeah.
Her middle name is Charity.
It was, because I made a nasty remark about her in the library at Windsor Castle, and she said, my middle name is Charity, which brought the house down and deflated my... Another story. So I think by the end of the 80s, early 90s, in terms of charity, in terms certainly of tax, we had arguably the most generous regime in the world, including the United States. The next thing that I want to talk about, which I think is equally important, is that and it happened within the Charities Aid Foundation. If you wanted to hold your money in a bank, then they were quite iffy about it and charged a fee. And there was no idea that the Bank, National Westminster Bank or whatever, would be terribly helpful. Again, accidentally, because the Charities Aid Foundation, with high inflation, a lot of money, and we had to have liquidity because we never knew when somebody was going to withdraw the money, so we didn't have money in equities, we had a big chunk of money. And we used licensed deposit takers in the City of London to get us the maximum rate of interest, for us, I have to say, rather than our clients, on that money. So it suddenly occurred to me, why are we paying these people? Why can't we be the kind of amalgam of a whole lot of charities, all with a lot of cash? So we become the principal. So at a slightly fractious lunch, I said to the people running our licensed deposit scheme, I'd like to make you a suggestion. You all become much richer if we become a cooperative for money in the charitable sector, and then we use you as a paid agent rather than a principal, because I'm proposing to become the principal. So when they worked out the figures, they agreed. One guy bought an aeroplane as a result of this, I have to say. So we suddenly found ourselves a licensed deposit taker. Then in 1986, we had the big bang, and we were told, you can't be a licensed deposit taker, you've got to be a bank or go out of business. So I thought, well, this is a good idea, let's be a bank. So we became a bank, and we set up a thing called CAFCash. The most amusing, am I going on too long? No. The most amusing thing about the bank, still in my attic, was the third meeting when some heavies came down from the Bank of England wondering really whether we were a bank or not. And they started to ask some questions. Well, my finance director at the Charities Aid Foundation was a guy called Norman Donaldson, of the Donaldson family. His mother was something like the mayor of the bank of the city of London, and his other uncle was the master of the rolls and so on. So Norman was just a terrific guy. His only problem was that he had a most vicious stutter. So this is why I ended up in my attic talking to the Bank of England. He had a rather wonderful secretary who was very, she was a strong-minded woman who knew exactly what was going on and so on. And she was actually running this bank for Norman, and she was very capable. So question number 3 was, where overnight do you keep all the registers of depositors and so on? So Norman said, Superloney said, well, we keep them completely safe. So the Bank of England said, well, where do you keep them completely safe? And Norman said, and Superloney said, off-site. So the Bank of England then said, whereabouts off-site? Down with the net. Superloney said, much safer than that. So the Bank of England said, well, can we just get to where these things are kept overnight? Superloney said, well, they're just up the road. So the Bank of England said, well, where up the road? And Superloney said, well, they're actually in my garden. So the Bank of England, and Norman said, and the Bank of England said, whereabouts in your garden? And Superloney said, I'm not sure I should tell you. So the Bank of England said, hold on a second. I think probably you should. And I said to Superloney, for Christ's sake, where are they kept? And she said, in my greenhouse, but they're under a flower pot. So the Bank of England took us aside and said, I think probably if we're going to be a bank, we need to deal with you properly. Can you imagine the FSA dealing with that situation? No, you can't. The Bank of England were just incredible. Anyway, they became a bank. Then, having become a bank, I thought, well, or rather the Charities Aid Fund trustees, I should be thought, what about investments? So with the help of Cazenove, who I didn't like very much, we set up several common investment funds, the Capital Growth Fund, the Income Fund, and the Total Return Fund. And then after that, with Deutsche Asset Management, we set up a thing called the Sustainable Something Fund, which is a kind of ethical fund. So we suddenly found ourselves, therefore, and this is really to say to you, how much has changed? There are now common investment funds, there are now banking systems that relate to the sector and are part of the sector. And our next move was to set up investment funds so that people, not so much charities trying to protect their money and making it grow through the banking and investment funds, the other side of the equation, donors could make social investments. And I think the Charities Aid Foundation helped enormously by Triodos and the Queen Juliana Foundation in Holland, which was way ahead of CAF in terms of investments, way ahead of the United States. Holland is always well worth looking to, and it is now. I mean, they're doing things that I think we should be learning from in the University of Rotterdam, is it, or something like that? Foster, you're nodding your head. But there are people there ahead of the UK in terms of research and their ambition for the sector, I think. Anyway, we set up a thing called Investors in Society, which after a long struggle, not least with Richard and his acolytes and the Bank of England, turned into the Charity Bank. We then discovered that a charity bank shouldn't take too many risks. So if you look at the profile between giving it away, which has to be high risk, all the way across to where we got to the charity bank via the spectrum of investment activity, there was a bit missing on the right-hand side, as I look at it, which was high-risk investment. So we set up a thing called venture capital run by John Kingston. So over those 10, 12 years, the Charities Aid Foundation tax, pressure on government, etc., via various means, setting up the infrastructure, setting up a portfolio of client-facing financial arrangements, had, I think, got as far as it possibly could. So things then became a bit boring. So we then looked internationally. Actually, we'd been doing that for some time. So briefly on the international side, when I was with the Spastic Society, I went over to America and Canada because I suddenly realized after 3 weeks when James Loring, my director, said to me, "What are you doing about the shops?" This was at the Spastic Society. And I said to him, "What shops?" And he looked at me slightly aghast and said, "The shops you're responsible for." So I said, "Oh." Anyway, the shop development, which is now so prevalent on the high streets, was pretty limited at that point. The Spastics and not many others were there. But the successful deployment of shops was in the United States with a vast chain, which you probably never heard of, called the Goodwill Shops. And they were making whacking great amounts of money for American charities. So I thought, well, I'll go over and see them. And that was my first introduction to what was going on in the United States. My second introduction was to be invited to the Salzburg Seminar, which I'm sure you may have heard of. I don't know whether it's still going on. Is it, Kathy? The Salzburg Voluntary Sector Seminars? It is, yeah. Well, I was on the first voluntary sector seminar and found myself amongst some pretty significant faculty. There were faculty of 7, and we had 30, 40, 50, I don't know what they were called, students or something that we were supposed to be telling things to over a period of about a fortnight. But the faculty consisted, as the chairman was Brian O'Connell, who was the head of the independent sector of the United States, Susan Beresford, who was the head of the Ford Foundation, Lester Salomon, who I think at that point came from the Urban Institute before he moved to Johns Hopkins. There was a professor from Heidelberg, whose name was Peter something, and then there was myself. And the whole thing went very well and was very interesting because one met these people, particularly the ones like Brian O'Connell and Susan Beresford and Lester Salomon, and over a period of a fortnight, became friendly. It was also quite, the faculty fell apart at one point because the Americans and one of the members of one of the people who was supposed to teach was a tax man from Egypt. And he came forward at one point saying, well, the way we deal with tax exemptions in Egypt is you can't set up a charity in Egypt unless you have somebody from the tax department on the board of the charity. So I said, well, that's a fantastic idea. We should have that in the UK. It would save so many lunches. We could just get where we wanted to in one move. Whereupon all the Americans came wading in saying, independence, the IRS should never, et cetera, et cetera. So, I mean, it was anyway, as a result of that, I got to know Lester Salomon quite well. And I'm pretty sure he was still in the Urban Institute because I remember going to Washington to speak to him. And he had, the Urban Institute, not surprisingly, had research on 8 urban centers, Washington, wherever, I can't remember, Los Angeles, etc. And I said to him at that point, coming from an organization called Interphil, the Standing Committee on International Philanthropy, of which I was a director, we would like to do what you're doing, but with 8 countries, not 8 towns. So Lester said, well, all right, we need some money. And he eventually came to a meeting in Bonn, hosted by the Stifterverband für die Deutsche Wissenschaft, a guy called Horst Niemeyer. And Bill Aramany, the head of the United Way, a $3 billion organization in the United States, was also there. And I remember distinctly Horst saying, well, this is a very good idea, we must certainly get on with it, but where are we going to get the funding from? And Lester sort of drooling a bit at the possibility of funding, which always turned him on, as did Marilyn Taylor, I think, at one point. But leaving that aside, that's another story. Bill Harriman came round and said, what are you in for, what are you in for, what are you in for? So we suddenly found ourselves, Interphil, the Standing Committee on International Philanthropy, handing over Lester Salomon a chunk of money in order to develop 8 countries. And sometime later in the 3 years later, I think, Helmut Annenheimer came in some role, I forget what. When Interphil folded, which it did voluntarily, in order to replace itself by Civicus, and again, the Charities Aid Foundation paid for the research. Christopher Zealey did the research, which appointed Brian O'Connell and Joseph, who's the head of the Council on Foundations, became the co-chairman at Civicus. And Civicus was set up. Lester did a runner. And instead of his first reports had Interphil, and then Lester Salomon, and probably Johns Hopkins. But as soon as he saw the opportunity, he nipped out of the side and set it up in his own right. It now has courses for companies. I think it's still very significant, and I think it's accepted, isn't it, by the United Nations as the official sort of statistical figures for philanthropy in I don't know how many countries now, and it's a big part of the statistical international program. We can claim some tiny credit for that. Going on too long, briefly, Europe. The Hague Club was the major European get-together of foundations, very pompous, and etc., right? So with a number of people, I think in 1989, which was the year the Berlin Wall fell, there was a meeting of the European Cultural Foundation, the Stifter Fan Charities Aid Foundation, as a result of which probably the most significant voluntary sector in Europe was set up, which is called the European Community Foundation. It's now huge, and it has big, posh members from Italian banks and Spanish banks and so on, various other things. Probably I've gone on long enough. Can I just conclude by asking you a question? I've described anecdotally the changes that have taken place since 82, 30 years or so. I think, I'm not accusing you, but I suspect you may also think we now have a mature civil society sector. So, we've got that. So this organization does that, whether it's the Institute of Fundraising or the NCVO, whatever it is, the jigsaw is put together. I think that is an appalling thought. I think over the next 30 years, things are going to change probably faster than they've changed over the last 30 years. So one of the things that I would like to discuss with you is whether you're sympathetic to that view. I've just recognized you, forgive me, or not. I think that in 1942, 82, 12, 42, things will be radically different from what they now are. The issue is, where do we want to be and how do we get there? What step do we take in the next 2 years to get to where we want to be in 2042? What effect will immediate information technology have? What effect will globalization have? What effect will the disastrous economical situation where you can't increase taxes because people won't pay them, where you can't increase the amount of cuts because people start bleating? What is the equation in this country that is going to create a civil society in 30 years' time which is fit for purpose? That's my main interest. Thank you.
Thank you very much.